Welcome to the 19th Century Dress and Textiles Reframed Network's November at Home event. I'm Nico. I'm the intern for the group. I'll be hosting the event. I helped to plan it. It should be a very interesting talk. We have 3 speakers. Our theme for today's event is going to be cross-dressing in relation to the 19th century. So as mentioned on the Eventbrite, the format is going to be a 10-minute talk followed by a Q&A, 10-minute talk, Q&A, 10-minute talk, Q&A. Like Robin said, we just ask that you put your questions in the chat, remain muted, and then Anna, our lovely question master, will be going through and asking the questions after the fact. So please feel free when the speakers are speaking to put any questions you have in there, and then we'll go through them. So it should be around maybe a little over an hour or so. We'll see the length of time. Yeah, so we can get started. I'm going to introduce Jane. So our first speaker is Dr. Jane Hattrick. She's a fashion, textile, and design historian whose work queers specific designers' archives. Access to the private archive of Sir Norman Hartnell resulted in her master's, PhD, and subsequent publications. So she's going to be presenting for us today. Jane, if you want to share your screen and then go ahead and present. Oh, make sure to unmute yourself.
Okay, got it.
On the, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Now I need to go back and I can't go back. There we go. Hello everybody. So you can see that in fact I have changed the title of my talk in the weeks since I agreed to do this. And it's now called At Home on Bruton Street, 100 Years of Transcestry on One London Street, 1870 to 1979. So this talk takes liberties with the long 19th century, treating it as a long length of knicker elastic. And I correlate Hartnell's lived experience, he was born in 1901 and died in 1979, with that of closely relatable 19th century figures Fanny and Stella, Frederick William Park and Ernest Bolton, specifically Stella, who died in 1903, aged 57, when Hartnell was just 2 years old. So I reframe Fanny, Stella and Hartnell's lives as a part of 100 years of trans history, lived out in part on one specific street in London, Bruton Street, and the crinoline as a part of a trans dress history hemline, a time-travelling garment worn in parallel pockets of queer time. I've been wrestling with pronouns in terms of how to refer to Hartnell here. In his lifetime, he used or was given various names, including Ethel and Gladys at university, and in private, Miss Kitty and also Mrs. Freeman. More on this later. But for the purposes of this talk, I will use the pronouns he, him, as used by him in his lifetime in public. Fanny and Stella used the pronouns she, her in public in their lifetimes, so I will adhere to this in my talk. In the late 30s, Walter Benjamin challenged the linear approach to historical history through Marxist historical materialism, using the example of fashion's constant returning to past styles, such as the crinoline, to create new looks. The age of the crinoline is positioned between 1845 and 1870, famously produced at the House of Worth in Paris and revisited by Paris and London couture in the 1930s, and by Hartnell himself to dress the new Queen Consort, Elizabeth, from 1937. It was probably at that time, as the crinoline became a significant model in his fashion collection, that Hartnell began to wear crinolines himself. Born in the late 30s, the crinoline becomes what Benjamin describes as the past charged with the now, blasted out of the continuum of history. And also in line with Evans and Vaccari's time in fashion, the crinoline is worn in parallel pockets of queer time or uchronic time, where fashion's imaginary, with its capacity for fantasy and scrambling time, rewrites fashion history as a kind of fiction. In her book, Transgender History, Susan Stryker defines the term transgender in reference to people who move away from the gender they were assigned at birth, people who cross over, trans, the boundaries constructed by their culture to define and contain that gender. And these boundaries are particularly visible in the second half of the 19th century and first half of the 20th century, with strictly defined binary dress codes and gender roles in this 100-year period. The trial of the scandalous he-she ladies Bolton and Park in 1871 attracted international attention. Fanny and Stella were arrested at the Strand Theatre on Thursday, the 28th of April, 1870, and charged at Bow Street Police Station with what Neil McKenna explains as the misdemeanor of public indecency, which included dressing as women, and the felony of the abominable crime of buggery, and of behaving in such a way as to induce and incite other persons feloniously with them to commit said crime. On their arrest, Stella, then aged 21, gave a false name and a fictional address, 2 Bruton Crescent, before relenting and admitting to being Ernest Bolton. Following suit, Fanny admitted to being law student Frederick William Park, giving her address as lodging at number 13 Bruton Street, Mayfair. In his 1955 memoir, Norman Hartnell remembered that he had made the decision to set up his own couture house on April the 23rd, 1923, and the first premises was in the upper floors of the Georgian townhouse at number 10 Bruton Street, no longer in existence, and Hartnell was then aged 22. In the 1934, the couture house moved across the street to occupy the Georgian townhouse at number 26 Bruton Street, with Hartnell's flat on the top floor and workrooms in the Mews House behind it in Bruton Place. Architect Gerald Lacoste and interior designer Noah Wakefield provided the Art Moderne glass showroom and chandeliers. Hartnell's office, known as the Empire Room, and his interiors at his homes in Lovell Dean, Windsor, and also the Tower House in Regent's Park. Both of these properties were remodeled by Lacoste and Wakefield, were furnished with a mixture of Queen Anne and Regency furniture, Victoriana and much-coloured Bristol glass and Venetian glass mirrors. Hartnell was often photographed professionally amongst his vast collection of decorative objects in themed room settings, creating camp interior spaces, building worlds in which to entertain and which reflected his feminine and authentic self. Rather than positioning Fanny and Stella as 2 gay men dressing as women working as rent boys, as previous historians and writers have done, Simon Joyce retroactively positions the lives and trial of Fanny and Stella as a trans narrative. Joyce writes that it's the recovery of fragmented detail in the various witness statements taken at the time of their arrest and used at their trial in May 1871 that he states helps us understand how such lives might have been lived in the period before medical transition became possible. For example, Stella's mother's statement, contradicting earlier statements about Stella's cross-dressing, revealing that her child had been dressing as a girl since early childhood and that she'd given her many of her own dresses. Of course, we understand today the distinction between being transgender and cross-dressing, and also that self-identification as trans is not dependent on medical transition. For Fanny and Stella, and for Hartnell, theatrical performances in which all 3 dressed in women's fashionable clothing on stage, enabling them to embody their identity as trans women, were a key part of their lived lives from a young age. All 3 were not simply men who dressed as women on stage and reverted back to wearing men's clothing at home in private. Fanny and Stella not only wore women's clothing on stage, in their childhood theatricals, touring shows and drawing room comedies, but also in public and everyday contexts, such as shopping, dining out and visits to the theatre. They aimed to pass as women, and indeed court transcripts and witness statements from their trial in 1871 demonstrated the confusion felt by many involved. Even when dressed in male attire, albeit with a more feminine cut to the jacket, nipped-in waist and exaggerated revers, witnesses insisted the pair were women dressed as men. McKenna writes, one reviewer of Stella's performance in the 1868 touring production of A Drawing Room Entertainment noted, "We may add Mr. Bolton very cleverly personates female characters, and that it's difficult for a spectator to realise the fact that he is a make-up for the occasion." And the Detroit Advertiser and Tribune, dated June the 3rd, 1870, noted that witness after witness came forward and told how they'd met these young ladies at the theatre, in the parks and at races and elsewhere, had been fascinated by their beauty and grace. And one witness said he'd visited them in the company with Lord Arthur Clinton, and that although Bolton was on this occasion dressed in men's clothes, both himself and Lord Arthur were convinced that he was a woman. We know this not to be true, as Stella and Lord Arthur Clinton were lovers and had set up a house in as man and wife, and Stella had calling cards printed that read Stella Lady Clinton. Hartnell, as the laws shifted, with the introduction of the Labouchere Amendment to the Criminal Law Amendment Act in 1885, which made gross indecency between two adult men punishable by 2 years imprisonment and hard labour. And society became more intolerant, with cross-dressing associated with homosexuality and increased cultural anxiety from the late 19th century towards the mid-20th century. Hartnell went from playing the female lead from the age of around 12 or 13 in more serious theatre, such as Shakespeare productions at school, to performing female leads in Cambridge comedic theatricals wearing his own designs, emulating the latest Paris fashions, which were made up by court dressmakers in Hanover Square. By 1925, the Daily Sketch reported on the girl men of Cambridge and the new spirit of hatred crystallising, viewing their loathly effeminacy as expressions of modern life. Like Stella, reviews of his female impersonation were favourable. In the Sunday Illustrated newspaper dated the 31st of December 1922, writing about Hartnell as one of London's newest and cleverest dress designers, the article goes on to say, amongst other accomplishments, Mr. Hartnell is a very clever female impersonator, publishing a photograph of him as Kitty alongside the text. Hartnell always aimed to pass, not to parody. This was best captured in studio portraits rather than press photographs. At the same time as Fanny lodged at 13 Bruton Street, Fanny and Stella rented a room in a house on Wakefield Street, Bloomsbury, known as a house of accommodation, which provided rooms for young men in order to dress up as young women. The police raided the room, taking personal letters and returning to gather up the sisters' makeup, hairpieces and garments, which were displayed at their trial for their prosecution. The Detroit Advertiser and Tribune noted the extent of their wardrobe. In their apartments were found the most complete and expensive collection of ladies' wearing apparel, walking suits, evening and ball costumes, bonnets, chignons, curls, gloves, corsets and underclothing, rouge, pearl powder, jewellery, etc. Personal interviews with Hartnell's workroom staff provided similar lists. Embroiderist at Hartnell's from 1955, Maureen, whispered in an interview, "Because you know we used to make dresses for Hartnell, crinolines, and Louis told you all about that." Miss Louis was Hartnell's stockkeeper. "Because Louis used to have to go out and buy wands and all sorts. And he didn't like anyone there after 6 o'clock. So the mind boggles, you see, we didn't really know who they were for. They used to go under the name of Mrs. Freeman in the workbook." Miss Louis also told me that in the late 30s she'd taken love letters over to the local barracks to the guardsman Hartnell had fallen in love with. No crinoline survived that can be identified as being worn by Mrs. Freeman. However, this well-worn pastel blue and lace pyjama suit, embroidered with pink sequins with corresponding sandals in a man's size 9, was identified by Maureen as being made for Hartnell by herself and Anne in the 1950s. Anne Wright remembered doing Hartnell's personal fittings upstairs in the bathroom in his private flat on the top floor of 26 Bruton Street, and that he wore face powder and had long nails on which you could see traces of nail varnish. She described Hartnell as essentially in the wrong body. Further snapshots of Hartnell, firstly posing at the French windows of his bedroom at Lovell Dean, then lying on his bed wearing a polka dot silk pyjama suit with artificial rose corsage, fluffy mules and makeup, taken in 1953, the year he designed the Queen's coronation gown, shows that Hartnell continued to wear garments in ultra-feminine styles and fabrics in private, long after his public performance on stage had ceased in the early 20s. Both Stella and Hartnell were active bricoleurs, creating their own identities through crisscross dressing, worn only in private in Hartnell's case. In conclusion, Neil McKenna tells the story of the hapless Hugh Mendel, who'd been arrested with Fanny and Stella at the Strand Theatre. He'd met them a few days before their arrest at the Surrey Theatre, where he'd been convinced they were women dressed as men, despite their insistence to the contrary. He'd fallen for Stella. Fanny and Stella had invited Hugh to pay them a visit the following day and had given them a card in the name of Frederick Park, 13 Bruton Street, Mayfair. He arrived and was shown into a spacious first-floor front room where the two were playing a duet on the piano and singing, and later they all decided to go out to lunch, and McKenna writes that Fanny and Stella disappeared into a bedroom for the best part of an hour and came out dressed as ladies. Imagine Fanny and Stella closing the front door of number 13 Bruton Street and making their way out to lunch, west towards Berkeley Square, or east on their way to the theatre in the evenings. Stepping out onto the pavements closed as their authentic feminine selves, they walk past number 10 Bruton Street, where Hartnell, 50 years later, was creating bespoke garments in silks and lace, embroidered with pearls and sequins that they would have longed to wear. Whilst across the street, quite literally behind closed doors at number 26 Bruton Street, perhaps 70 years or more later, Hartnell's bookkeeper, Miss Godley, returns after hours, fearing she'd left the safe unlocked. On finding the front door unlocked, she walks into the building, and towards the rear of the hall she encounters, seated, and I quote Hartnell's biographer Michael Pick, a figure resplendent in a sparkling evening dress. The silhouette of the wide embroidered crinoline skirt was familiar as the one devised by Hartnell in 1937 for the Queen of England. The figure moved. It was Norman Hartnell himself. Trans lives crisscrossing the streets of London, passing one another in parallel pockets of time, stepping over the boundaries constructed by their culture to define and contain that gender towards their authentic selves. The end. I can't hear anybody.
That was amazing.
Stop share.
Wow. So can you, while the questions are coming into the chat, is it okay if I start off, Nico? Okay. So I thought that was really amazing talk, Jane, and so poetic. And this idea of sort of haunting and traces of past lives, it's really set me thinking, you've got to make a film.
It is a film, isn't it?
It's so exciting.
I know. I think it was an absolute gift to discover. When I fell upon Fanny and Stella, immediately they came to mind. I think you and I were talking about the digital transgender archive, and I thought Fanny and Stella, and I knew all about them. I'd seen McKenna talking about his book. But when I opened the first pages and saw that they'd lived at 13 Bruton Street, I absolutely couldn't believe it. Because, you know, there they were in the same street. And obviously the passage of time shifts in legislation and the passage of time brings Hartnell indoors. You know, he can't go to the theatre dressed in
Okay, there's lots of questions. So Hannah has kicked off asking if Hartnell was aware of the history of Bruton Street and what sort of milieu it was. And
well, I mean, I think the history of Bruton Street is Mayfair obviously is the centre for haute couture, and that was where that part of the West End is where the couture houses, as we know, you know, Hardy Amies a bit later, Victor Steeble was across the road. There's, you know, Molyneux around the corner. That's where the couture houses were established in the early 1920s, because before that, obviously, it's court dressmakers. Whether he knew anything about Fanny and Stella, I've really no idea. So I don't know.
interesting. Nico wants to know, did any other members of Hartnell's workroom provide similar evidence to the designer's cross-dressing practice, or is this kind of one narrative from one individual?
Well, it's two, because it's Anne and Maureen together, and they Anne was became head of the workroom, and Maureen was the embroideress, and so Anne is doing the fittings and you know, making the garments and the pieces, and Maureen is embroidering them, and then they get tacked together and fitted, obviously. And he's Mrs. Freeman in the workbook, because, you know, all the models that are made up for individual clients so obviously have names. I don't know. There are other stories of seamstresses being terribly upset that they have to replace zips and fastenings because Hartnell and his friends have tried on the collection the previous night in the showroom and all the zips are bust. So, but also other stories of other couture garments in men's sizes being made in at Hartnell's too for his friends. But that's those little nuggets are sort of here, you know, a hearsay, not in proper oral history transcripts.
So, I mean, there are so many comments saying how moving, amazing photographs, very thought-provoking, wonderful. People have really enjoyed this. Nico's put in a comment that the Digital Transgender Archive is such a great resource and would direct anyone to access it. It's quite something. And Eleanor's got this rather strange comment that her grandpa grew up on the same street.
Absolutely amazing. Wow. Great.
Hannah would like to know
which number.
quite. Hanny, sorry, I'm saying Hanny and I'm meaning Hannah, sorry. Did Fanny and Stella circulate their female portraits, or how
Yes.
private were they?
I think they're taken by portrait photographers and then handed out to the people, you know, the theatre, the people at the theatre, or the people who come to their drawing room comedies or whatever. So they are dispersed, and one of the ones I think as carte de visite. So I think the little picture of Stella in her bota, you know, I think that's certainly one that's been, you know, multiple copies and handed out.
I mean, this whole thing of how much you share and how much you wear in private and what is acceptable. I mean, I think the whole, what did you call them? The girl men of Cambridge is just so fascinating. Was my godfather was one of these girl
I
men.
remember now you said that. Yes, yes,
Um,
yes.
we've
But
never
I
seen,
yes,
we
but
didn't see the photographs.
oh, that would be amazing if they turn up. But I think different. My difficulty has always been, firstly, my difficulty has been writing about Hartnell as a gay man for 15 years. Editors would not have it. It was an absolute nightmare. Finally, I actually began thinking about Hartnell as a trans history at the point of my PhD halfway through, but of course it was just a non-starter. It was hard enough to talk about Hartnell as a gay man. I understand that the 1920s, the trope of the effeminate gay man in makeup, dressing in women's clothes, you know, I feel that that's different. That is a different story to that of Hartnell. Cecil Beaton did that. I wouldn't say Cecil Beaton was trans. Eddie, in Who Inherited Noel, again, you know, he similarly. So that I'm not suggesting that all the girl men of Cambridge were trans or would have been trans. Obviously, but I think in this specific case, there's enough evidence to suggest that that he was. And then also, you know, what, as I was saying, as I said earlier, we understand today, you know, the distinction between cross-dressing and being trans, but also, you know, you can be trans without you know, reassignment surgery and hormones, you know, in this age of self-identification. And it's obviously impossible to say did Hartnell want to be a woman? You know, it's much more complex than that. I think with all characters, all we can say is that there's more to their gender identity, their genderqueer identity, than they're not than simply gay men cross-dressing, I would say.
That was really interesting. Are there any other questions for Jane before we move on?
I've got one last question for myself.
Go for it.
The issue of authorship, which came up at the Trans Day of Remembrance film event that EJ hosted on Wednesday, because last Wednesday was the Trans Day. It was 25 years of Trans Day of Remembrance. And one of the issues that came up was this wonderful montage of films with trans characters, documentary and fictional, from the 20s through to present day. And then there was a panel of trans film curators. And one of the things that they all said was that authorship's really important. And as a cis white lesbian, it's difficult. You know, I struggle with, you know, I'm not trans and I'm writing about trans history. So, you know, that I just wanted to flag that up as something I'm definitely thinking about. And then, of course, the dialogue with our present. So one of the things about Fanny and Stella's trial story was that the thing that was most upset and most consternation at the trial was that Fanny and Stella used women's powder room at the Strand Theatre, precipitating their arrest. So there are absolute mirrors with today's with what's happening today in terms of trans lives and trans women's safety in bathrooms, etc. So I thought that was extraordinary.
As you say, it's a synergy across the generations, isn't it?
Yes. Cool. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm very grateful.
Oh, yes, thank you for that wonderful presentation. Yeah, so we'll move on to Eleanor next, just for the sake of time. So Eleanor Medhurst is our next speaker. She's an independent researcher with a focus on lesbian dress histories. She's also the creator of the wonderful blog Dressing Dykes and the author of the recently published Unsuitable, A History of Lesbian Fashion, also wonderful. And she's going to be sharing her research on male impersonation and lesbian fashion. So you could go ahead, Eleanor.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Hopefully you can see my slides. All right. I've just brought them up here. Great. So yeah, thank you for having me. And thank you, Jane. That was so interesting. I am, of course, I'm Eleanor, as mentioned. And in this talk, I'm going to be talking about cross-dressing within the field of male impersonation and thinking about how this relates to lesbian or otherwise queer self-expression through dress and appearance. So the UK has a long history of cross-dressing for entertainment, which was obviously touched on in Jane's talk. But male impersonation took off as its own speciality in the late 19th century as part of the music hall phenomenon. In the 1870s, male impersonation as a genre of entertainment gained traction in the US as well. And this can be attributed to one performer in particular, Annie Hindle. British-born Annie had been performing since the age of about 6, but in 1868, when she was in her 20s, she moved to the US, bringing all that she'd learned on the British stage over the ocean with her. Male impersonators like Annie, among others, transgressed gender boundaries. They also, in many cases, openly loved women and other people who were transgressing gender. But the male impersonators who I've researched didn't, to our knowledge, live or understand themselves as men, even if they might have had complicated relationships with gender. So in this talk, I'm referring to them with she, her pronouns. Despite this, male impersonators who were recognized as women by the world around them used their lives on and off the stage to question what the boundaries of gender really meant. With this in mind, let's talk about Annie Hindle. Annie was, to quote the New York Sun from 1891, blonde, about 5'6", with a plump form, well-shaped hands, small feet, and closely cropped hair, which on or off the stage she parted on the side, brushing it away from her temples just as men do. She played a number of stock characters, usually the swell or the man about town, whose main characteristic was his distinctive and enviable fashion sense. Because of this, Annie often dressed in luxurious fabrics or cuts, branding herself the king of fashion. The swell twisted gender and sexual norms in a really interesting way. These performers were people perceived as women by the audience, but they were envied by men in the audience. They were fashionable and they were admired by women. Annie married a man not long after she arrived in the US in 1868, but they split after only a few months of being married. For the rest of her life, Annie's true passions were clear. Annie actually got married multiple times throughout her life. Often, most of them, aside from her early husband, were marriages to women. Her most famous wedding was in 1886, when she used a male name to marry her dresser called Annie Ryan. Annie Ryan was a pretty little brunette of 25 who made friends wherever she went. She dressed in her traveling costume for the wedding, while the female groom, now in her 40s, wore a men's suit. So these are all quotes from a contemporary newspaper, the Buffalo Evening News from 1892. The marriage was reported like this in the press, but despite this publicity, Annie Hindle's career survived unscathed. Clearly, being a male impersonator gave a certain level of cover. Gender ambiguity made room for socially permissible same-sex marriage. A year later, in July 1892, the Chicago Daily Tribune reported another marriage between Annie Hindle and Louise Spangle. And these aren't the only examples. Historian Gillian Roger has found additional marriage records that suggest that Annie Hindle had been using the name Charles in order to marry women from as early as 1868, which was the year that she arrived in the US. One of these marriages was between a Charles Hindle and a Blanche Duvere in November 1870. During this month in 1870, Annie was working with a variety performer named Blanche Duvere at the Metropolitan Hall in Washington, D.C. Notably, in 1871, Blanche Duvere also became a male impersonator and changed her name, or at least her performing name, to Blanche Selwyn. Blanche Selwyn's own male impersonating career is just as interesting as this possible whirlwind romance and this marriage that might have happened in 1870. Blanche, like Annie, favored the swell character, and her wardrobe was praised in the press. It was kind of one of her main points that attracted audiences to her performances. The New York Clipper said her singing is good, style dashing, costuming superb, and changes fair. I'm not sure, the changes aren't quite as highly praised as some of the other things. Blanche Selwyn, unlike some other male impersonators like Annie Hindle, who could be mistaken for men on a regular basis, was more obviously a woman in figure. She was bigger and with more curves than other performers, and she favored well-cut suits and highly embroidered waistcoats. Her shape and her close-fitting outfits made her more legible as a cross-dressing woman to an audience who saw gender in black and white. Her incredible fashionability on stage meant something different. Blanche Selwyn, when she was playing the swell, was an enviable figure, a masculine figure, and a female figure all at once. Her command of male clothing was irremovable in the eyes of the audience from her womanhood. It wasn't only Blanche who was inspired by Annie. Ella Wesner was a ballet dancer in 1869 when she and Annie Hindle crossed paths as performers. In 1870, Ella's own career as a male impersonator also began. Ella toured England from 1876 until 1880 as the New York Beau and returned to a successful career in the US, which lasted for over another decade. Ella is also followed by the story of a famous lesbian love affair. Though the details of this affair are less clear than some of Annie's marriages, we know that Ella ran away to Paris in 1872 with Helen Josephine Josie Mansfield. This dramatic elopement followed a love triangle between Josie and two wealthy men, Jim Fisk and Edward Stokes, which ended in Fisk being shot and killed by Stokes. Josie escaping the press and Ella supporting Josie with friendship or more were happy in Paris for 6 months. After this, Ella returned to her career in the US, which continued to thrive. The elopement was public knowledge. In 1891, the New York Sun mused that the only romance in Ella's life was her well-known escapade with Josie Mansfield, the Notorious. Ella's reputation didn't suffer from this once again, however. Like Annie, it added to her eccentric appeal. Being a male impersonator gave Ella a free pass to love women and for women to love her in return. It was all kind of just an act in the eyes of the public. In fact, after one of Ella's performances in San Francisco, a reviewer noted that if women were allowed into that specific venue, they would all fall in love. This was only an appropriate comment to make because Ella performed so well. If women were falling in love with her, then it was her masculinity that they were adoring. Her image was immaculate, captured in cabinet cards like this one, made to be shared, complete with things like top hats, matching velvet waistcoats, and tuxedos. According to the New York Clipper in 1870, she would have been easily able to walk Broadway in male attire without her sex being suspected. And maybe she did. Her image was most likely not only an act to Ella, it even stretched beyond the grave, as her final request was to be buried in male clothing. Another male impersonator who we only know a little bit about is Florence Hines, and this invisibility isn't unrelated to her race. She was clearly a talented performer and was compared to famous white colleagues in the mainstream press, including the most famous British male impersonator, perhaps of all time, Vesta Tilley. The divide between Florence's popularity and her legacy is very large. For years, she supposedly had the highest salary paid to any Black female performer throughout the US. But historian Hugh Ryan has found that he can only locate a single photo of her, which is this one, not the highest quality. What we do know about Florence makes her part of not only a history of male impersonation, but also of, from my point of view, lesbian fashion. The specifics of her costumes, other than this one low quality photo, might be lost to us, but we do know part of their effects. If she was such a popular performer and taking on the same numbers that people like Ella Wesner were, we can imagine what she might have worn. We can imagine her if she was dressed in velvet tuxedos and waistcoats, like those worn by Ella. We also know that Florence Hines loved women, or at least that she was publicly assumed to love women. In 1892, she was working as part of a groundbreaking venture for Black performers, the Creole Show. At this time, perhaps at the height of her fame, a local newspaper published an article that implied a relationship between Florence and one of her female co-stars, a singer named Marie Roberts. The paper's reports declared that the utmost intimacy has existed between the two women for the past year, their marked devotion being not only noticeable, but a subject of comment among their associates on stage. Who knows how many other such reports we might have in our hands if Florence's life and career had been recorded and preserved like those of her white contemporaries. This is just a glimpse of the life and dress of Florence Hines, but it is a fascinating one. So that was kind of a whistle-stop tour. You can find out some more about the lesbian significance of male impersonators' clothing. In my book, I do have a whole chapter on it, so I might as well give it a shout out. But I would love to know if you have any questions or comments and to discuss it some more. Thank you. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you. That was so wonderful. I think we've had already some questions.
Yeah,
Thank you.
there's lots of questions in the chat, and do keep them coming.
Yeah.
Some more in. Nico kicks off with Roger's book is a great resource, much recommended. I mean, I was really struck when you talk about the string of marriages. I had no idea that same-sex marriage was a thing. Is anyone else surprised?
Yeah. I mean, it's that she was only able to do it because they were being recorded as not same-sex marriages. They were all recorded. She used the name Charles Hindle for all of them, which was the name of her husband, who she married when she first arrived in the US. And they clearly weren't legally binding or like perceived as being legally binding because she kept marrying other people despite the previous people she'd married still being alive. So who knows how she actually saw them. But yeah, there's records of her marrying multiple women. Yeah.
Hannah Kay is asking, would performers like Annie work as freelancers hired independently for a performance, or would they be associated with a specific troupe or theatre through some sort of contract?
I think that it could, as far as I'm aware, I think that it could vary, that some people might have been hired for specific performances, whereas others were, like Florence Hines, part of a traveling troupe. Yeah, I don't really know the specifics about that element of it, to be honest, but I do think that if someone had more fame, they would have more flexibility of where they wanted to go, like Ella, who was off in traveling around the UK for years. So I do think that part of it is like how successful they were as a performer influenced that.
Sure. Hannah R is asking about public and private, and the theatre providing a sort of safety to male presentation. Were these women able to extend their male presentation off stage? I mean, was this acceptable?
Yeah. Honestly, it's kind of a lot of the time there is evidence that male impersonators did carry on wearing very similar clothes off the stage. And part of that is, again, if they were more well known, then they could get away with it because people who might see them would go, oh, that's just so and so who's a male impersonator. So they're just eccentric, they're artistic, maybe they're on their way to work. Whereas, but it also, if they're a particularly talented performer and if they have the right look, I suppose, then like I think it's Ella Wesner, that was the quote about she could walk Broadway wearing male attire. They can just pass, I suppose, as being a man and then can wear whatever they want. It really reminds me though of a later male impersonator, Stormy Delavery, who was working from, I think, 1955 to 1969 as a male impersonator, largely in New York, but around the US. And when she first started working, she cut her hair short and was still wearing female clothes out and about on the streets, but people were then reading her as a man in women's clothes. So she just started to wear suits out and about. I imagine that was also her preferred way of dressing because she continued to dress in a similar way throughout the rest of her life. But it was easier for her to be wearing these masculine clothes in her day-to-day as well as on stage because she was being read as a man on the street as well. So,
and do you think,
yeah,
there's a couple of points in the chat about the character, the archetype of the swell. Do you think the swell afforded some kind of what am I trying to say? It allowed people to be more experimental and to embrace gender in a different way. Do you think it gave more freedom?
yeah. I think that the character types are really interesting because with like the swell, for instance, there was such an emphasis on fashion, and that meant that performers who were really engaging with that role were able to be really fashionable and admired for it. Like I said in the talk, be admired for a very masculine fashions and the success that they had with that. Yeah, whereas a lot of the other roles were playing people like soldiers and character types that were more to do with a job role. So the swell is kind of very different from that because it's not to do with a job, it's to do with self-presentation and fashion. So it's a really interesting one to look at.
And Jane is pointing out this strange connection in the clothing. Ella's suit is so similar to that of Stella's. Was Stella influenced by Ella, another male impersonator she mixed with in the theatre? Perhaps. Interesting.
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions. Do we know who supplied their clothing?
Yeah, I don't have any specific references for who supplied particular items of clothing. I'm not sure if I imagine that a lot of the time it would have just been tailored by people who were making clothes for men. I would be interested to try and find out more about if they were getting them from places who were just creating clothes for male impersonators, if there was anything like that. But honestly, I don't know.
How are we doing for time? So do we need to wrap up?
Yeah, I think we may need to go to the next presentation. But Eleanor, if you want to go through and respond to some of the questions.
One last comment from Robin saying, Ellie's book is fantastic.
Thank you.
You've got to read it. And could you put the name of the book in the chat, please, Ellie? There are a couple of requests for that. Thank you so much.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. If we have more time at the end, we can circle back to any questions anyone has for Eleanor's presentation, Jane, and then for Hannah, who's going to be our next speaker. Hannah recently graduated from American University with a master's in art history. Her research covers issues of gender and sexuality in the visual and material culture of 19th and early 20th century Japan. She's currently an adjunct professor at American University, and she is going to be presenting her research for us today. So you can go ahead and share your screen.
Probably be good to unmute myself as well. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to present my research today. Boundaries of Femininity is the master's capstone, which I completed last year at American University. And the overarching goal of this project was to create and explore a lineage of images of women cross-dressing from 1800 to 1940. And in doing so, kind of highlight a corner of Japanese queer culture that's gone under-discussed. Particularly under-discussed is the section I'll be sharing today on geishas, gender play, and 19th century woodblock print. But before I get there, because the theme of today is cross-dressing, I feel I should acknowledge a major challenge that all English language scholarship on East Asian socio-historical phenomena faces, which is the gap in theoretical vocabulary between English and the local language. In this case, that cross-dressing has no direct translation in Japanese. There are various Japanese terms that can be translated to mean cross-dressing, and generally speaking, they are gendered more precisely than the English word. Danso, which I have here, literally means male clothing, but it is understood to mean a woman cross-dressing as a man. Danso has also morphed to both be a verb and a noun. So you can do danso and be a danso. This means in contemporary Japan, it is both a practice and an identity that someone can claim. So there's also a cultural understanding of danso that it is androgynous. It's about sitting on the border as opposed to completely crossing it. So this is just a small taste of the complexity that comes with discussing non-Euro-American queer cultures. We're not simply translating words, we are translating people's identities and experience, and inevitably those translations will be insufficient. So I feel visual culture can be a really powerful site for these discussions because they can make concrete the nuances that are lost in these acts of translation. So with that said, let's talk 19th century geisha. In Japanese studies, the female impersonators of the kabuki theater have dominated the discussion of early modern cross-dressing. In reality, in the Tokugawa period, which ran from 1604 to 1868, the women of the red light district had their own distinct cross-dressing tradition. And I see ukiyo-e prints of these women as the best record of that tradition. Generally, Western viewers perceive Japanese gender roles as being strictly defined, making cross-dressing a major deviation. However, this was not always true, especially in the Tokugawa period. So the images I discuss were all mainstream commercial images meant to depict desirable beauties. They play with ideas of androgyny and performance to appeal to an urban audience in the 19th century that had increasingly gender ambivalent tastes. We only see a backlash to these images when they transcend their creation for male consumption and become style icons for women of respectable families, inspiring those women to cross class boundaries and take on androgynous fashions. This print, titled Hiyoshi Sano Festival, was published in 1864. It is not the earliest image we'll discuss, but it serves as a good example of what cross-dressed geisha looked like. The geisha and the young girl are wearing a performance outfit called tekomae, which is comprised of a bright red juban, or undergarment, multiple outer kosode, which are pulled down around the waist, and plaid pattern tatsuke hakama pants. While elements like the red juban and the multi-patterned kosode are feminine items of clothing, the tatsuke hakama and the geisha's forward-folded top knot were considered exclusively masculine. The cross-dress geisha always features this mix of masculine and feminine fashions that create a kind of androgyny and ambiguity. But the image does set up a juxtaposition for the viewer with another woman just beyond the torii gate that shows you the difference between a geisha and a quote-unquote normal woman. So geisha and their red light district neighbors, the courtesans, were accustomed to being the juxtaposition to what was proper. Since the 17th century, sex work and its related entertainments were confined to a 20-acre walled plot in Asakusa called Yoshiwara. This government-licensed red light district used geographical isolation to generate a unique culture that participated in a rapidly expanding consumer market that David Pollock calls the, quote, economy of desire. In this new market, every corner of Edo culture participated in the rat race to bring in new customers and contribute to a sensual, theatrical, and irreverent urban landscape. Yoshiwara did this by becoming the inverse of the everyday world. Yoshiwara was a parody that separates the pursuits of pleasure and the pursuits of the wife. And nowhere is this sense of parody more apparent than in prints depicting Yoshiwara's Niwaka festival. Celebrated on the 8th month of the lunar calendar, it honored Kurosuke Inari, the patron god of Yoshiwara. During the festival, the women of the district would put on music and dance performances while dressed like men. In this Kigakawa Eizan print from 1811, we see a group of geisha dressed for a lion dance, a typically male-only performance. The most interesting element Eizan has included are the names of the geisha depicted. The print was not just a beautiful picture of women at the festival, but an advertisement of their services. Potential clients could look at this, see something they desired, and go to Yoshiwara to get it. In this case, what they desired were geisha dressed as men. So Eizan's choice of geisha over courtesan was meaningful in the Bunka and Bunsei eras, which ran from 1804 to 1830. Because the dominance of Yoshiwara and their spectacular courtesans in the 18th century had ended. Instead, 19th century men moved their attention to the more easily accessible, unlicensed red light districts like Fukagawa. The residents of Fukagawa were the town geisha, one of which is depicted here in Utagawa Kunisada's 1820s print, the competitive type. The most striking element of her appearance is the patch of shaved hair behind her forelocks. This was a cut for young men. Kunisada has also assigned her a boyish character. The Japanese title, Tatehikiso, can be translated to competitive, but also prideful. Most interestingly, it is a word that describes a woman who pays on behalf of a man, particularly a geisha who pays for her client. So, why did geisha, adopting men's style and demeanor, appeal to male urbanites? The answer is an aesthetic called iki, which can be simply understood as what was chic at the time. A geisha could perform iki for her client through gallant straightforwardness, flirtatiousness, and a nonchalant knowledge of all things. A geisha like this fulfilled a male client's desire to have a sophisticated lover. However, this heteronormative setup is misleading. As scholar Joshua Mostow has pointed out, nearly half the sex workers in Edo at the time were young men. So limiting iki to only women would have been ridiculous to the Japanese of the Bunka and Bunsei. Bourgeois townsmen found their iki ideal in both women and young men. These young men were called wakashu, and they can be understood as a kind of third gender because they had not come of age and therefore were not men. They occupied a similar place as women in the sexual hierarchy as objects of male desire. and geisha got their masculine inspirations from the wakashu, which resulted in the kind of androgyny that became characteristic of this cross-dressing practice. This liberal atmosphere where gender and sexuality were all subject to change and play was only acceptable within the red light world, which existed outside the feudal social hierarchy. The geisha, as I said before, were the juxtaposition to upper class women, desirable but not respectable. However, geisha would soon gain a new audience. Utagawa Kunisada would create many of his new Iki It girls as illustrations for the literary works of his friend and collaborator, Ryute Tanahiko. Tanahiko's primary genre was ninjoban, or books of human feelings, that featured stories about love with professional women, particularly geisha, as the main characters. This genre became very popular with women, and these townswomen started to fashion themselves after their favorite ninjoban heroines, including the geisha's new masculine fashions. This, along with a slew of other slippages between the red light world and respectable society, was a step too far for the feudal government. Starting in 1841, following the shogun's death and a decade rife with city gang wars and natural disasters, the feudal government decided to set things right with a complete purge of the entertainment industry. The sex worker had become a dog whistle for societal woes. As Amy Stanley puts it, prostitutes began to provoke nightmares about the decaying countryside, the failing state, and the crumbling family. Discomforted by this reflection, men blamed women for showing them what they preferred not to see. The sex worker was too visible, and her visibility had now inspired townswomen to transgress and public morals to decay. So the government arrested 4,181 sex workers and moved 2,165 back into the confines of Yoshiwara. Kabuki actor prints, beautiful women, and erotica were banned from the print industry. Ryute Tanahiko and his fellow writers were publicly punished, and their books were burned. Tanahiko's punishment was particularly harsh, and he would ultimately die from his injuries in 1842. So the reform period would end in 1843. It was quick and harsh and did not help the shogunate. And it did not cripple the print industry. Printmakers and artists just adapted and found ways to compromise audiences' subversive tastes and government's conservative directives. These compromises manifest in that 1864 print we began with, where the sexually charged image of the cross-dressed geisha can be neutralized in the much less politically rife genre of landscape. So the longer thesis continues into the 20th century, where I discuss the Takarazuka Review, the all-female theater that would become the dominant representation of female-to-male cross-dressing in Japanese culture to this day. And by putting this 19th century case study side by side with Takarazuka, I hope to reveal how Takarazuka's more subversive elements and unique brand of gender non-conforming performance is not simply a product of its adoption of Western cabaret aesthetics, but born of its connection to its native culture, a culture with an already well-established history of gender non-conformity in performance, both in kabuki and amongst the geisha. All right. I hope I didn't go too far over time.
Oh no, perfectly on time. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. And anyone that wants to learn more should visit Hannah's site. It's a great source, and like Hannah said, it has more information into the 20th century, lots of great connections, and expands on what you the time period you presented on today as well.
Yeah, and I'm willing to, if people have questions about that second half in the 20th century, those images they saw at the end, I'm happy to answer questions about Takarazuka as well.
Fantastic. Because such a group rich with information. Yeah.
So while the questions are coming into the chat, I wondered if I could start off with one for you. Do we know anything about how the women felt about their dressing practices? Are there any voices that you've uncovered that or is it all stuff?
Yeah, it's hard to. Most of our accounts within the within the like period of the shogunate, are like secondhand, written by mostly male authors. It's actually not until around the turn of the century that we get the first major memoir by a working geisha. But by that point, the industry had changed so much that like her account doesn't really give us a lot of idea of what life or the profession was like in this earlier part of the century, since so much had changed by that point, and the profession of geisha changes significantly over the course of the centuries it existed. So yeah, that's like kind of the hardest part. And we have evidence of these practices, and there is good reason to believe that the development of these practices were kind of a collaborative effort between the owners of the tea houses the geishas worked for and the geishas themselves. Because this was the nature of how other parts of the red light district developed its culture, where like women would think of new ways to keep up their clientele, alongside like the tea house or brothel owners, would kind of support these like new ways that they would come up with to keep business going. So we do see this kind of collaborative effort between the women and the people running the brothels, typically men, although sometimes women ran the brothels as well. But we have like kind of secondhand accounts in the time. So like men who frequented the district, writers who talked about the culture of the district, but not a lot of firsthand accounts from the women, which is really frustrating when you do the research.
Have you got any information in regard to the printmakers that produced the images?
Yeah, so most of the ones so Kikukawa Eizan, Utagawa Kunisada, and Hiroshige II, these were all like fairly well-known names in the industry. They would generate, and they would be part of these kind of schools. So for example, Utagawa Kunisada, Utagawa is his school name, his like art school name. So that's not his real last name. And Kunisada is his artist name. So they would be part of these big schools under a master. They would generate these images, usually prompted by the publishing house. So the publishing house would reach out, have a prompt like, this month we want to put out another bunch of images of geisha. And so the printmaker would take this prompt, make the images, and then send them to the publishing house to be printed and published. And this is how the whole industry kind of functioned. But the like prompts were not specific. So like they would just give them a general topic they wanted to put a series out on. And it was up to the artists to decide kind of what they thought would sell. And the artists were very tapped into the culture. So they knew what was stylish. They knew what was chic. They knew what people wanted. They were often contributors to this culture. They frequented the district and the theaters. So they knew what was in and kind of fashionable at the time.
So there's a commercial element here, and that controls the consumption and distribution and so on. What was popular? Eleanor's asking, well, everybody's saying this is so interesting. There's so many comments in the chat. You should see. People are saying this was wow. So Eleanor, it reminds me of some of the work I've done on Japanese magazine Seito, and some of the women who wrote it in the 1910s, who often dressed in men's clothing. And it's fascinating to hear about a deeper history that goes back to the early 19th century, where such practices were ingrained within this culture. Jane is asking for a bit of clarification. Were the cross-dressing women sex workers in competition with the underage boys? What's the crossover there, or the relationship?
Yeah, so they were all working in the same districts, essentially. So there are a handful of districts, and now, like, I use the term sex worker as a modern term, but I mean, you could also use the term body work, because there's a great variety in the kind of work they did. Because only like a small, like, not all geisha were sex workers. Some of them were just entertainers in tea houses and never ended up having sex with clients. So there's a great variety of work that people in these districts would do. actually having sex was only a small fraction of that work. So they were set, most of them were some form of did some form of body work or sex work. And they all were working in these same districts. So Joshua Mostow, who I quoted, has pointed out in his discussions about Iki, this like aesthetic that is born of the brothel districts, that more than half even, sex workers in Edo were young men, which they ranged in age also. And the geisha knew that these were their competitors for clients. This was like a fairly well understood thing. And so it's reasonable to believe that they would kind of be swapping fashions and styles between these two groups of people as they compete for the same clientele base and participate in the same kind of culture in the district.
Well, does that imply that the boys were using feminine attributes in their dress? I mean, does it go both ways?
It does go both ways. So images of wakashu that we have from the period range. So some wakashu like specialized in female impersonation or like specialized in female dress, and then some would very specifically dress masculinely because their clients preferred if they wore men's clothing and not women's clothing when they met with them. So there's like a variety, and there's a lot of bleed over between the two groups. So yeah, wakashu would absolutely dress in women's clothing as well.
And Chris is bringing it up to contemporary popular culture. Do you think the androgyny of contemporary manga characters is a deliberate or mindful reference to past practices? How ingrained is this?
Yeah, so I think you know, there's like a long way to go to get there, but what I discuss in the 20th century section is that these performance practices, they take on new aesthetics with the introduction of Western culture into Japan, but they stick around. I mean, we still have this kind of interest in blurring the lines. Androgyny never leaves the tastes of Japanese consumers. They continue to be interested in this, like in all of their theater forms. Kabuki gets to continue to live on as like a major traditional theater form in large part because of this taste. And so all parts of media seem to pervade this interest, like beautiful boys and androgynous girls, and they all like play a part, and it has this very long history in the culture. So yeah, I think like it takes you a while to get there and you'll make many stops along the way, but I do think that there is a connection between these past traditions in the culture and what we see today in Japan.
Okay, a thread that continues. There are a couple of comments in the chat. I think people were very shocked to hear of the purges and the reform period and the harshness of the crackdown. And I was wondering if the images in any way reflect this. Can you read them as being post crackdown or, you know, pre? What's the difference?
Yeah, so something I discuss on more at length in the thesis are these like post-tempo reform images, which are, we no longer see the women alone or like just the images of the women. They're always like put against the backdrop of some kind of landscape. The titles of the images no longer refer to the women specifically. So in the case of the like Kiyoshi Sano festival, the printmaker is like, oh, the topic of the print is the festival and not the woman in the print. And this is how they skate censorship, right? If the print is not about the woman, then it's not against the guidelines. So like they would mix up all of these genres, particularly inlaying them in like landscape series, to kind of get past this. So that's why, and a couple of these purges happened over the course of the Tokugawa period. The tempo is just the big one that happens in the 19th century. And they actually rarely produce the results that the government hope they do. And then usually very quickly they stop enforcing the rules. So only like a decade or two after the tempo reforms, the rules become lax again, and people don't the censors don't seem to be as serious about enforcing them. But we do see a distinct change in the choices that printmakers make in the post purge period.
Okay. So you are so astonishingly knowledgeable, Hannah. Know so very much. I can see in the chat that your website is there's a link in the chat, but have you published this? Have you got a book?
So I don't have a book yet. So my website is the like capstone project that I completed for graduation. And I plan to like continue this work for PhD because this is a very long period of time and there is a lot of content that isn't covered in the thesis that I still want to cover. So the goal is to like expand this out to my dissertation project and then hopefully publish because it's a very
Hurry
big
up.
project. Yeah.
Amazing. Nico, I think the questions have come to an end. I guess we're out of time as well, aren't we?
Yeah, we're a little over the hour mark. But yeah, I put Hannah's website in the chat. I recommend you all check it out. And like Anna said, we're looking forward to published work. Yeah, so I guess we'll wrap up for today. I want to thank all the speakers for contributing.